welcome to this edition of our podcast, Soil Matters. We're very excited today to be visiting with Dr. John Shanahan with the Soil Health Institute. I have known John for almost as long as Veris has been in business. I think he operated one of the very first Veris systems in 1997 when he was a professor at Colorado State. I've always found John to be someone who really understood early on that soil matters. And you know, when you work in the dryland soils of eastern Colorado and I farm in central Kansas, we recognize early on how good soil makes a difference. You know, Mother Nature doesn't always cooperate with rainfall. And so that's translated over the years at his career there at Colorado State and then at USDA ARS. I did a stint with one of the major seed companies, and now he's an agronomist with the Soil Health Institute. So welcome, John.
Well, thank you, Eric, for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to visit with you today about, as you say, soil matters. It's the basis for every farm's productivity potential.
It is, and I see you have a cover crop image behind you. I didn't want to be outdone, so I've got a picture of one of my wheat fields from Kansas. So
yeah, and it's a good picture, I might add.
Thanks. So let's start off. Just if you would give us a little bit of a rundown about the Soil Health Institute and kind of what you do there at SHI.
Sure. So the Soil Health Institute is a nonprofit. It was formed back in 2015, started out through an effort of the Noble Foundation. And our mission, the mission of the Institute is to basically encourage the adoption of soil health practices such as no-till and cover cropping. And we do that by sort of working with stakeholders to kind of look for gaps in research and adoption practices, and then identify funding source, and then go out there and try to fill those gaps by either conducting research or again, trying to figure out ways to help further the adoption of these practices. So we've actually have about 12 PhD scientists on our team that are doing some work around identifying various soil test methods for quantifying the metric of soil health practice. In other words, try to come up with a suite of sort of common soil test tools that could help a farmer identify, is my soil healthy or is it not? So kind of a project that's involving a lot of different long-term research sites, sampling all those sites that have different conservation practices, and then seeing which tests give us some idea of the health of the soil. And then the other tactic that we're taking at the Institute is trying to build a business case for the adoption of soil health practices. And that's a project I'm involved with. It's through a grant we received from Cargill. And what we've been doing here, along with my colleague Archie Flanders, an ag economist on our team, we've been interviewing farmers around some of the practices they've adopted on their operation. And this is across the corn and soybean belt. And so what we're doing is taking that production information and inputting it into what we call a partial budget model that allows us to quantify the economics of those practices such as no-till and cover cropping, and determine whether there's in fact a good strong business case for the adoption of these practices. So that's been a very interesting project that I've been involved with for the last year. We've finished interviewing those farmers and are now digging into the information, and we'll be producing some reports and some results from that project here in the very near future. So we'll be watching for that at our website.
Great, John. I think those projects you mentioned are really key to advancing soil health. I think on the laboratory measurement side, at Veris, we've done a lot of comparisons of laboratory tests and try to understand, how accurate labs can be at different soil properties, because we're trying to develop sensors that correlate with lab measurements. And, we found the standard lab tests of, NPK, pH, those things that labs test routinely with lots of good accreditation and tests. Those are very repeatable, very reliable. I guess we found that some of the soil health tests may be a little more qualitative and kind of give a direction about things, but maybe need some of that same scrutiny that conventional soil tests have had. So I think that's wonderful, and I think one of the biggest questions that most farmers have about soil health and some of these practices is the economics and how does it affect the bottom line? Because we all want healthy soil, but we also want to stay in business. So we need to know how to do both. So that's great. Let's start off with kind of a question about, and you touched on it briefly there, but let's define soil health. If you're out in the field and you're on one side of the fence and you walk across the other side of the fence and one's healthy soil, it's been managed well, meeting those objectives, and the other one isn't. What are the differences? What would I expect to see? What would a test show? What are the differences between those two soils?
Right. Well, so soil health is a lot like our human health situation. I mean, there is no one measure. Like, for example, blood pressure tells us a little bit about ourselves, but it doesn't tell us the whole story. And so that's been the challenge of coming up with tools to identify and quantify soil health. You have to almost look at this like when your doctor brings you in for your annual checkup. He does a bunch of blood tests. He takes your blood pressure, measures your heart rate, and so things that those are similar challenges that we're facing in trying to quantify soil health. But if you're trying to look at that, like you mentioned, Eric, about looking across the fence row from a field, there's ways you can see it with your eyes. For example, if you can look across, there's two fields, adjacent fields, and one's been tilled pretty regularly, and then another one there's been no till, and you look at that field right after a rainstorm, and what are you going to see? You're probably going to see a lot more water running off of that off of that tilled field than you will off the no-till field. So that's a measure that we can observe with our eyes of a health. That soil that's been no-tilled is healthier because it has probably better aggregate stability. You've got cover on that field. It's intercepting that residue is intercepting raindrop and reducing the impact. You're not letting soil wash away. The water infiltrates better. It's into the soil. It cycles nutrients better. You've got probably more organic matter because you haven't tilled the soil, and the water coming off the field is cleaner. So those are ways that we can see with our eyes. And then, of course, the ultimate measure for our definition of what we have at our institute is what is soil health. It's the capacity of a soil to function as a vital living ecosystem and sustains plants, animals, and humans. So soils serve a lot of masters. And of course, when we talk about farmers, the ecosystem is the agroecosystem. It's how they're going to make their livelihood. And of course, that's important to the individual farmer that owns that land.
Oh, good. I know this year we went about a month without rain, and the summer crops, especially the soybeans, that were on good soil with healthy soil, no-till, definitely waited for that rain better than the soils that had been depleted and weren't healthy. So yeah.
Right.
So let me play devil's advocate a little bit with you, and be a skeptical grower, asking about this. So, I think soil health is one of those things. It's like diet and exercise, flossing our teeth, whatever. It's like we all want to do it. We all know it's right. Nobody's against, those things. Nobody's against soil health, but there's a difference between being, kind of passively for something, and then really being actively engaged in doing it and making the effort. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's management, other resources, whatever, to really do it. So, as a skeptic, why should I care about soil health?
And that's a great question, Eric. I mean, as a farmer, you have to be around next year and be able to pay the bills and pay the banker and whatnot. So it's the first and foremost factor when we're talking about soil health is how is this affecting the bottom line of my operation? So, for example, we were just talking about some of these benefits of capturing more soil water. One of the first things that we've heard growers talk about when we've interviewed them is, well, one of the reasons they've adopted no-till is because they're burning less diesel fuel and using less machinery. So they're saving money there. So that's a pretty simple business decision for them. Is not only are they saving a little bit diesel fuel, wear and tear on their machinery, but they're catching a little bit more water, and that's going to end up producing a little bit more bushels of grain for them. So there's that it's always got to be about the economics. The farmer has to be able to make a profit, or they won't be in business the next year. So yeah, I mean, so there's things like we talked about the no-till and cover crops. If you can catch more water, especially in the western part of the grain belt, why, you know, water is always the more limiting factor. And so anything we can do to catch that water, whether it be with no-till, keeping residue on the surface, or cover crops, there are also, it cools the soils off. It reduces evapotranspiration. You oftentimes, when you do these sort of practices, you have more you have a crop a system that's more competitive with the weeds, and so you may not have to apply as much herbicide. You're cycling nutrients a little bit better. When you have higher organic matter values in the soil, that leads to more mineralized nitrogen available to the crop, so you perhaps don't have to buy as much nitrogen fertilizer. Even things like P and K get recycled sometimes under these healthy soil conditions, if you will.
There we go. Sorry. But again, I guess continuing my skeptic role here. What about annual cash rent feel? You know, where you're not going to have perhaps not going to have the soil in your operation long enough to get some of those longer term benefits. Does this fit on like just an annual cash rent type field?
Well, I mean, it depends on the landlord that you're negotiating with. Some in visiting with these farmers that we interviewed for our Cargill project, we heard some of those growers indicate that they were able to rent more land because of the fact that the landlord saw that it was improving the long-term productivity of that farm. So, but that wasn't always the case. I mean, that's probably one of our biggest challenges in getting soil health practices adopted, is because some of the folks who own the land aren't as educated about these practices and how they might benefit their long-term productivity. I mean, over time, you could make a case for an argument for the case that that value of that land is going to go up if you continue to apply soil health practices to that farm. So, yeah, and the other thing, Eric, I sort of forgot to mention here previously, was the consumer is pushing a lot of this demand in, because a lot of folks who buy their food at the store are wanting to see their products produced in a more sustainable way. So in other words, if a farmer can document, for example, that they've been using these practices, cutting back a little bit on nutrients, fertilizer, those things produce what we call less greenhouse gases, have cleaner water quality coming off the farm, and whatnot. There's beginning to become a movement that a lot of the folks who are sourcing grain from growers, so folks like Cargill, for example, are seeking producers who are actually producing their products and buying products from those farmers using some of these practices. So if it can be communicated to the end consumer via the folks like Cargill, why there's an opportunity perhaps to be able to market and differentiate your product in the marketplace, if you will, using some of these practices.
Well, there's no question that consumers, I just see that in my own family with sisters-in-law and daughters-in-law, that they're a lot more conscious of that, maybe than we are those of us that live in rural America. Don't see it quite like those in the suburbs. I see a lot of labels on packages that say, it's all shade grown, fair trade, non-GMO, whatever, healthy, sustainably grown, whatever. Is there an initiative going on? I think there is, but if you enlighten me with some of what you know about initiatives that are really going to pull it off and really kind of coalesce around, a certification that really kind of has some teeth in it, and growers will need to pay attention to. Is there Are there any of those that you see kind of emerging from that are going to be that way?
Right. I mean, there are beginning to become tools available again to that are that are almost precision ag kind of tools that capture information about how a particular crop is grown. That information is communicated all the way through the value chain. So again, what these tools do is they kind of benchmark a particular farmer and how they compare to practices that can avoid the production of greenhouse gases. Again, the things we've been talking about, managing nutrients efficiently, using 4R concepts, using things like no-till, cover cropping, will produce a product that's going to have less environmental impact than using more conventional practices, if you will.
Right, right. So you mentioned greenhouse gases there, and I just want to touch briefly on soil carbon and the soil carbon trading deal. I think we're not going to talk about that on this conversation. We're going to talk about things that are kind of more real, and you can do it today, and it makes a difference. I think the whole soil carbon side of things from a getting paid for soil carbon is something that's it's out there perhaps in the future, but it's political and it's something we can't really rely on. And what we're talking about are things that really make a difference on a piece of ground today. So we're going to just set that aside for when that's maybe a little more real. Anything else that comes to mind as we think about kind of making the case with the grower? Stories you've heard from growers you've interviewed that maybe are a little surprising about how um, soil health has really paid off.
Right, and I mean, quite a few of these growers that we talked to mentioned that they perceived to see yield benefits. It wasn't. It was at least half of the growers mentioned that. So I mean, again, the adoption of these practices were beneficial to in terms of yield. Many of them talked about the use of less herbicides because of cover crops created more weed competition. Less use of machinery because of no-till practices, reduction in sometimes in the application of pesticides because again these rotation practices kind of disrupt pest cycles, create some competition for weeds, and so at the end of the day they're able to apply a few less inputs to their field, and again that's what allows them to see that economic benefit. But and back to that carbon thing, even if there is no carbon trading thing, the soil carbon or soil organic matter, again, there's the economic benefit to that. For when you increase organic matter in the soil, you increase the water holding capacity and you increase the capacity of that soil to mineralize nitrogen. So in and of itself, soil organic matter and carbon provide benefits to the grower if they're willing to spend the time and effort to build that organic carbon pool in their soils.
Organic matter is such a critical thing, and if probably almost everybody in agriculture, if you were to look at two different soils and one's blacker and got more organic matter and organic carbon in it, they're going to say that's the better soil. I mean, it's just
right.
we all know that. We all if you've ever planted a garden or a crop, you want the darker stuff. Yeah.
Right. And talking to these farmers, that's one of the key attributes they always identify. Sometimes if we'd ask, did your organic matter value increase? Well, we didn't test it, but I could see that field that had been in no-till and cover cropping was darker. So I believe to be the fact that soil has higher organic matter values.
Right, right. So as we think about what's kind of on the menu of practices we can do as farmers, we know that not everything fits everywhere, and we're going to have to fit the field, fit the farming, region and rainfall and all. So let's walk through kind of a menu of what's kind of on the menu and what may fit for a northern Illinois, southern Minnesota, heavy soil, wet area versus the area where we know all too well, the 16 to 28 inch rainfall area out here.
Right.
Where cover crops may struggle a little to catch on. Let's kind of just walk through that, if you would, please.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's about a suite of about 5 or 6 tools that we would like to say that are available to growers. And again, that we wouldn't suggest that they're going to fit for everybody, but I'll just kind of run down through the list of them, and then we can kind of talk about where they might fit better and where they might have a little bit more challenges. So we talked about keeping the soil covered, so keeping crop residue on there. There are just so many good things that happen when you keep residue on the field. You reduce the impact of raindrops on the soil, which in turn leads to less soil and water erosion. Soil temperatures stay cooler. You have less evapotranspiration. You're saving more water in the soil. And then another tool that we like to talk about is limited amount of soil disturbance. So when you turn that soil over, you expose that organic matter to the air, and it oxidizes that organic matter that you spent so much time and effort and money trying to build. So to the extent that you can minimize tillage, that's going to be a good thing, because that's going to result in higher organic matter values. You're going to see better aggregate stability, less soil compaction, a whole bunch of list of things, of benefits that you'd see from limiting how much tillage you do. And maybe first and foremost is you're spending less energy, less
Okay,
diesel fuel.
but let me play devil's advocate again. Let's say I farm in southern Minnesota. The things you just described to me, keeping moisture in the soil, increasing organic matter. My organic matter is already 5%. I want my soil to warm up. I'm a skeptic on this.
Right.
What do I do?
Right. And so to your point, Eric, what many of the farmers that we interviewed, for example, in Minnesota, they've used adapted no-till to what we call strip-till. So basically, it's a practice that applies a small amount of tillage to a very narrow strip in the field, right where the seed's going to be placed. And so that's typically done in the fall of the year. And what that ends up doing is drying that little space of soil out, so that next spring when he wants to come and plant, that soil there is just a little bit warmer, but you're still seeing the benefits of having residue on the rest of the field. So it's only about probably a tenth of the area that you're actually doing some disturbance. So it's a nice compromise in terms of keeping residue on the surface and minimizing disturbance, but also facing those challenges of planting crops in the more northern latitudes of the Corn Belt, for example.
Right. And I think what you said about the root channels and the earthworm holes, all those. I mean, infiltration helps everybody. It helps us in dry land save more of the rainfall that falls, and in those wetter environments helps move that soil, the moisture down into the profile better. So root channels, I think holes in the ground are always good.
Right. Yeah. And a follow up to that, something like a cereal rye cover crop, it would be a good example of that. That has a very hardy root system that we've actually visited with some of the growers in southern Illinois, for example, and they were showing us pictures of those cereal roots penetrating those clay pan soils down there and allowing the cash crop to explore more of the soil profile. So again, another benefit of introducing some plant diversity into the crop rotation. Things like cereal rye can accomplish those goals for you.
Okay, so residue above ground, root channels, keeping those in the ground. Those are good. Keep crop rotations. What else?
Yeah, crop rotations. Introducing some of the farmers we talked about introducing wheat into a cropping system. Again, wheat is a very competitive species, will compete with weeds sometimes a lot better than things like corn and soybeans. And again, throwing in a more diverse crop rotation into your practice breaks up a lot of the pest cycles that we face when we tend to be more monoculture. So that was one of the things that some of the growers talked about is as a way to reduce costs, such as herbicide applications and whatnot.
What else?
So some of the farmers we talked to had livestock in their operation, and so the ability to harvest the forage from that cover crop, for example, produced a lot of income stream for that operation. And so besides just getting the benefits of growing that cover crop, in terms of what we just talked about, root and soil properties, the grower was able to also basically pay for the establishment of the cover crop by the forage that was harvested and fed to the livestock.
Good,
So
good.
yeah, those are about 4 or 5 of the tools that, and again, just as we've been talking about, sometimes a specific tool works better in some places and isn't so applicable in other places. The other thing I think Eric is worth mentioning is that is this whole concept of precision ag and nutrient management. I think a lot of our listeners have probably heard about the 4 Rs in terms of how we manage things like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. And just to kind of review those concepts again, it's important to get the right placement of that particular nutrient, whether it be in terms of broadcast versus strip applying, banding, get the right source applied, and then the right rate, and then at the right time. All those things, and a lot of the growers that we interviewed in this project did incorporate those practices into their system, and they spoke to the fact that those things are part of that whole soil health management system, if you will. It wasn't just a one tool that provided them the benefits that they saw, but it was a suite of things that put together in totality provided them the yield benefits, the reduction in the nutrients applications, and so on and so forth. So it's the whole package that you need to be thinking about when you do these things. And it's maybe also worth mentioning that many of these farmers that we talked to had been at this for quite a number of years, and they mentioned that early on in their journey they saw some challenges, and so they didn't want to start out and do this on every acre. It was important for them to kind of start slow and then work, experiment, try different things, and figure out what works and what doesn't work. And so I think that's maybe the one other takeaway we should have from this discussion is that if you're new and you're just considering jumping into these sort of things, get to a lot of meetings, talk to a lot of the folks that are doing this, and make sure that you've learned from their mistakes. Don't go through the school of hard knocks, so to speak.
Right. The early people had to do it themselves, but the rest of us could come along a little later. They can learn from them. And I have to say, the people, the farmers I've talked to who are soil health advocates and are doing that, I've kind of always been amazed. I've always thought they would maybe be the smaller, medium farmers, more the type of farmer that would adopt those. I won't say ex-hippie, but kind of that, more of that style. And I've been amazed at how many of them are just big, progressive, several thousand acre growers who are just doing it as it's a great economic way. They love healthy soil, but they're not so in love with healthy soil that they lose sight of the economics. They're doing it with good balance. I do want to also say, John, just to reiterate what you said there about the 4 Rs. I think one of the things that when we hear soil health, so often we immediately think, oh, the biology. It's all about the kind of the organic matter and the biology. So we tend to not think about it as the soil chemistry side as much. But a healthy soil is one that's got adequate nutrients. The pH, in the right spot, and adequate phosphorus and nitrogen and the rest of the nutrients as well. So thanks for sharing the 4 Rs. I think that's something everybody can do. Maybe cover crops don't fit everywhere. Maybe true, no-till, maybe cattle will fit, but everybody can do the 4 Rs, or work towards the 4 Rs.
And I'll just to add to that, Eric, your goal is to optimize the placement of these nutrients so that you're not limiting the growth of the crop, because you're trying to fix carbon dioxide. And if you don't have a healthy green corn plant or wheat plant that's limited by some nutrient, then it's not going to produce as much grain. It's not going to store as much carbon in the soil. And so it's really critical that all those things get optimized.
Let's kind of wrap this up. Final topic or question kind of relates to kind of more the precision agriculture side of this. You and I have both spent a lot of time in our career trying to understand and kind of promote the concept of right place, understanding what's going on in the fields. How does a soil health effort initiative, what can precision ag bring to the plate whether you think about the tools in precision ag with soil mapping and yield mapping and GPS and all that, what is precision ag, digital ag, what are you going to call it, going to bring to the table?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. I mean, I think a lot of the tools that are available to us in precision ag, like yield mapping, remote sensing tools, proximal soil sensors like you've worked with, they can tell us, the remote sensing and yield maps can tell us about how well the crop did, but then we also need those soil sensors to tell us why the crop didn't do so well there. And so if we can find specific areas in the field where the productivity is limited and confirm why it is with the soil sensing technology, it's possible maybe we can apply some of these soil health practices like applying organic amendments like manure and things like that to specific areas in the field where organic matter might be really limiting. And it's oftentimes not real economical to haul manure to an entire field, but if you can target particular areas where yields really being limited by organic matter, there might be some benefit to doing some things like that. If you have some fields say in the eastern corn belt where drainage is a real problem, you may definitely want to get some cover crops established in those areas to help you with improving drainage and things like that. So yeah, I really feel like there's a nice marriage here that can go on between these practices that we've been talking about, soil health and the precision digital ag tools that have been under development for the last 20 years.
And I think just another one on my list would be the soil sampling. If you're going to take some of these soil health tests, don't just take them randomly in the field, or take some from the poorest soil, the most eroded, heavy clay, side slope, whatever, B horizon,
Right.
hard, and then from the nicer, darker soil, and then be able to track, use that as your baseline, and then be able to track.
Exactly.
There.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you don't have those precision tools that help you kind of be strategic about where you pull your samples, you're gonna be a lot less efficient and probably cost you more money to get those soil health samples. And so, exactly, using those tools to here's a poor area of the field, here's a better area of the field, and go out there and separate out the soil samples that you get from those two fields, so that you better represent the field.
Right. And it's sure been my experience that no-till helps the poorest areas the most. The biggest increase comes from just building up that organic matter in those poor soils. It's funny you talk about the putting organic manure or whatever on those poor soils. Yeah, I've had people tell me before, precision ag's not new. My grandpa used to always haul his excess manure up to the eroded side slope,
Right.
clay bank kind of a deal, and try to build it up. So just like we always know, there's the more things we think are new, the more that they really harken back to
Right.
good solid agronomy that practitioners have known for years.
Exactly.
Well, John, thank you for this conversation. I appreciate all the work you've done over the years at the different stops you've had along the way, and wish you all the best there at the Soil Health Institute, and look forward to connecting with you at some point in person.
There you go. It's
All
been
right.
a pleasure, Eric. Thanks for the opportunity to visit with you. Have a good one.
Thanks, John. Bye.